Thank you so much, all of you, for being here, and many thanks to Judith Sebesta and Bob, my entourage, my bodyguard. Thank you to everybody who's been involved in making me feel so very welcome here in Vermilion. My talk is called, here it says, The Necessary Orphan, Becoming an Orphan. It does have an epigraph, Shall I be ashamed to kill my mother? And it is from Aeschylus's The Libation Bearers. So we'll start on that happy little note. Time, last spring. Place, an undergraduate classroom located in the airy, well-wired precincts of Silicon Valley University. Oops, I mean sun-kissed Google Apps University. I'm avoiding the pedagogical business at hand. The class is my annual survey of 18th century British literature, and it is as rockin' and rollin' as you might imagine, given the subject. In order to probe my students' reactions to a startling and, to me, disturbing article I have just read in the Harvard Alumni Magazine. Now, this paper seems at first to focus on students at elite colleges, the very cream of the cream, but in fact, I think it's a more general phenomenon, and I'd be very interested in your reactions to it. The piece by Craig Lambert, one of the editors of the magazine, is entitled Nonstop. Today's superhero undergrads do 3,000 things at 150%. As the breaking newsfeed title suggests, the piece, on the face of it, is anecdotal and seemingly lighthearted, a collegiate Ripley's Believe It or Not about the overscheduled lives of today's Harvard undergraduates. More than ever before, it would appear, these poised, high-achieving, fantastically driven, and disciplined students routinely juggle intense academic studies with what can only seem, at least to an older generation, a truly dizzy-making array of extracurricular activities, pre-professional internships, world-class athletics, investigative journalism, social and political advocacy, startup companies, volunteering for nonprofits, research assistantships, eating clubs, peer advising, musical and dramatic performances, podcasts, and video making, and countless other, no doubt virtuous and resume-building pursuits. The pace is so relentless and competitive, students say, some plan their packed daily schedules down to the minute, i.e. shower 7:17 a.m. to 7:19 a.m. Others confess to getting by on 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night during term time. Especially over the past decade or so, it would seem, the average Harvard undergrad has morphed into a sort of lean, glossy, turbocharged super hamster. Look in the cage and all you see where the treadmill should be is a beautiful blur. I am curious if my Stanford students' lives are likewise chock-a-block. Heads nod yes. Deep sighs are expelled. Their own lives are similarly frenetic. They can barely keep up, they say, particularly given all the texting and tweeting and cell phoning they have to do from hour to hour too. Do they mind? Not hugely, it would seem. True, they are mildly intrigued by Lambert's suggestion that this explosion of busyness is in fact a relatively recent historical phenomenon, and that over the past 10 or 15 years, especially, uncertain economic conditions plus a new cultural emphasis on marketing oneself to future employers have led to ever more extracurricular add-ons. Yes, they allow. You do have to show off of your well-roundedness once you graduate. That is, engage in a kind of energetic self-branding, thus the supersized CVs. You'll be needing, after all, to advertise a catalog of competencies, your diverse intellectual, scientific, artistic interests, original turn of mind, ability to work alone or in a team, time management skills, enthusiasm, unflappability, not to mention your altruism and moral probity, generosity to those less fortunate, lovable, cute quirkiness, and pleasure in the simple things of life, such as synchronized swimming, competitive dental flossing, and Antarctic exploration. Yes, it can often be frenetic and done with an eye toward resumes. One Harvard dean of students observes, quote, "But learning outside the classroom through extracurriculars is a vital part of the undergraduate experience." He says, "Extracurriculars are now as important as coursework." I wouldn't have said that 40 years ago. Yet such references to the past, truly a foreign country to my students, ultimately leave them unimpressed. They all laugh when I tell them that during my own somewhat damp Jurassic-era undergrad years, spent at a tiny, obscure, formerly Methodist school in the rainy Pacific Northwest between 1971 and 1975, I never engaged in a single activity that might be described as extracurricular in the contemporary sense, not, that is, unless you count the little work-study job I had toiling away evenings in the sleepy campus library. What was I doing all day? Studying and going to class, to be sure, reading books, listening to the stereo, falling in love, or at least thinking about it, eating lager tuna melt sandwiches. But I also, I confess, I did a lot of plain old sitting around, if not outright malingering. I've got a box of musty journals to prove it. After all, nobody even exercised in those days, nor did polyester exist. Once you'd escaped high school and obligatory PE classes, goodbye hirsute Miss Davis, goodbye scratchy cotton midi blouse and ugly twill gym shorts. You were done with that. We were also countercultural back then, especially in the Pacific Northwest, where the early 70s were still the late 60s. Possibly the 1860s. The students now regard me with curiosity and vague apprehension. What planet is she from? But I have another question for them. While the author of Nonstop obviously admires the multi-talented, multitasking type of undergraduates that Harvard attracts, he also worries about the intellectual, the emotional, and indeed physical costs of such all-consuming busyness. In a sudden turn toward gravitas, he quotes the French film director Jean Renoir's observation that, quote, "The foundation of all civilization is loitering." And he wonders aloud if unstructured chunks of time aren't necessary for creative thinking. Quote, "If Renoir is right, and if Harvard students are among the leaders of the future, then civilization is on the precipice. Loitering is fast becoming a lost art," unquote. And while careful to phrase his concerns ever so delicately, this is the Harvard alumni magazine after all, he seems afraid that one reason today's students are so driven and compulsive is that they have been trained up to it since babyhood. From preschool on, they are accustomed to their parents pushing them ferociously to make use of every spare minute. Contemporary middle-class parents, themselves, in this case, usually highly accomplished professionals, quote, "groom their children for high achievement." in ways that set in motion the culture of scheduled lives and nonstop activity. He quotes a former Harvard dean of student life, quote, "This is the playdate generation. There was a time when children came home from school and just played randomly with their friends out in the traffic," my mother used to advise, or hung around and got bored, and eventually that would lead to something. Kids don't get to do that now. Busy parents book them into things constantly, violin lessons, ballet lessons, swimming teams. The kids get the idea that someone will always be structuring their time for them, unquote. The current dean concurs, quote, "Starting at an early age, students feel that their free time should be taken up with purposeful activities. There is less stumbling on things you love, more being steered toward pursuits," unquote. Some of my students at this begin to look downright uneasy. Some are now listening hard. Such parental involvement can be, to me, it seems, distasteful, even queasy-making. Quote, this is Lambert again, "Now parents routinely help them with assignments, making teachers wonder whose work they are really grading. Once, college applicants typically wrote their own applications, including the essays. Today, an army of high-paid consultants, coaches, and editors is available to orchestrate and massage the admissions effort," unquote. Nor do such parents give up their busybody ways, apparently, once their offspring has landed a prized berth at some desired institute of higher learning. Indeed, writes Lambert, parental engagement, even in the lives of college-age children, has expanded in ways that would have seemed bizarre in the recent past. Some colleges have actually created, quote, "a dean of parents" position, whether identified as such or not. This is true. One of the places I went to had a dean of parents to deal with them. Quote, "The helicopter parents who hover nearly over nearly every choice or action of their offspring have given way to snowplow parents who determinedly clear a path for their child and shove aside any obstacle they perceive in the way," unquote. Now, as a professor, I have had some experiences with helicopter parents, and were the weather patterns on the West Coast slightly more rigorous, I'm sure I would have encountered snowplow parents as well. Indelibly etched on my brain, I tell my class, is a phone call I received one winter break from the aggrieved mother of a student to whom I had given a C- in a course that fall. Now, the class had been a graduate course, a PhD seminar, no less. The woman's daughter, a first-year PhD student, had spoken nary a word in class, nor had she ever visited in office hours. Her seminar paper was not impressive. Indeed, it was one of those for which the epithet gobsmackingly incoherent might seem to have been invented. Still, the mother lamented. Her daughter was distraught. The poor child had done nothing over the break but cry and brood and wander by herself in the woods. I had ruined everybody's Christmas, apparently, so would I not redeem myself now by allowing her daughter to rewrite her seminar paper for a higher grade? It was only fair. While startled to get such a call, I confess to being cowed by this direct maternal assault, and against my academic better judgment said, okay. The student did rewrite the essay, and this time I gave it a B. Pretty generous, I thought. It was better, but still mostly incomprehensible. Yet the ink was hardly dry when the mother called again. Why wasn't her cherished daughter receiving an A? She had rewritten the paper. Surely I realized, etc., etc. One was forced to feign the gruesome sounds of a fatal choking fit just to get off the telephone. Did such hands-on parental advocacy, I inquire, trouble my students? My caller obviously represented an extreme instance, but what do they think about the wider phenomenon? After all, having internalized images of themselves themselves, if only unconsciously, as the standard bearers of parental ambition, or so the alumni magazine had it, the undergrads at Harvard didn't seem particularly embarrassed by mom and dad's lobbying efforts on their behalf. According to one survey cited, only 5 to 6% of undergraduates felt their parents had been too involved in the college admission process. Once matriculated, and now there's an interesting word, most students took regular parental contact and constant maternal-paternal advice as completely normal. A third of all Harvard undergraduates reported calling or messaging daily with a parent. Yet here it was, just at this delicate punctum, that I found myself reduced, however briefly, to speechlessness, blindsided. So how often do my students, all mostly senior English majors living in the Stanford residential houses, text or talk to their parents? Broad smiles all around, embarrassed looks at one another, whispers and some excited giggling. A lot. Well, how much exactly? A lot. What's a lot? They can't believe I'm asking. Why do I want to know? I might as well be asking them how often they masturbate. And then it all comes tumbling out. Oh, like every day, sometimes more than once. At least 2 or 3 times a day, group laughter. My father emails me jokes and stuff every day. My mother would worry if I didn't call her every day, nodding heads. Well, we're always in touch. My parents live right nearby, so I go home most weekends too. Finally, one student, a delightful young woman whom I know to be smart, conscientious, and level-headed, confesses that she talks to her mother on the cell phone at least 5, maybe 6, even 7 times a day. We're like best friends, so I call her whenever I get out of class. She wants to know about my professors. What was the exam? So I tell her what's going on and give her, updates. Sometimes my grandmother is there, and I talk to her too. I'm stunned, I'm aghast, I'm half gaga. I must look fairly stricken, too, Electra keening over the corpse of Agamemnon, because now the whole class starts laughing at me, their strange, unfathomable lady professor, the one who doesn't own a television and obviously doesn't have any children of her own. What a freak. But when I was in school, I managed finally to gasp. All we wanted to do was get away from our parents. We never called our parents. We despised our parents. In fact, I splutter, and this seems to be the showstopper, quote, we only had one telephone in our whole dorm in the hallway for 50 people. If your parents called, you'd yell from your room, tell them I'm not here. After this last outburst, the students look a bit aghast, not to mention morally discomfited. No, these happy, busy, optimistic Stanford undergrads, so beautiful and good in their unisex t-shirts, hoodies, and J.Crew cargo shorts, so smart, scrupulous, forward-looking, well-meaning, well-behaved, and utterly presentable, just the best and the nicest, really, simply cannot imagine the harsh and silent world I am describing. At the time, I was not sure why this conversation left me so dumbfounded. But it did. It stayed with me for weeks, and I told numerous friends and colleagues about it, marveling yet again at the bizarreness of contemporary undergraduate life. One said she talked to her mother 5 or 6 times a day. Not so surprisingly, the exchange in class had reawakened in me in the moment a fairly dismal psychological sensation that I've felt with regard to teaching before, but have typically been loath to acknowledge, so out of step with official norms does it seem, namely that teaching sometimes makes me feel lonely. Not all the time, but enough to notice. Lecturing before a class, I will suddenly feel utterly and painfully bereft. A cloud goes over the sun. Though putatively in charge, I'm suddenly estranged from my charges, self-conscious, alone in a tunnel, as it were, the object of their attention and somehow obscurely responsible for everything that is taking place, but unable to speak a language anyone understands. I feel sad and oppressed, smothered, almost unable to breathe. It's the kind of sensation one might have in an anxiety dream, in fact, the sort in which you feel abandoned and overwhelmed and without something you desperately need. They've gone away and left me in charge of everything. At least in my own head, it's the sensation of orphanhood. One rallies, of course, I assure you. Professor Freakout soldiers on, and after a while the feeling goes away. The business of the day returns. But the psychological cloud can remain for a while, a peculiar miasma over existence. By asking my students all these intrusive and impertinent questions, I decided afterwards, I clearly brought such a mood on myself. Their charming, fresh-faced, matter-of-fact responses, yes, they were just as busy as their Harvard counterparts, but yes, they also managed to stay in surprisingly close touch with parents and other family members. That is, they loved and were loved in return, had somehow triggered in me my orphan reflex. I had only myself to blame. I chastised myself for having temporarily forgotten that students today, and not just those at Harvard or Stanford, of course, live in a new, exciting, exacting 24/7 world, one utterly unlike the one I inhabited as an undergrad. They seem reasonably content with their lot, in fact, seem to take for granted the endless connectivity, all the networking, Skype interviews, Facebook posts, and presciently scheduled play dates. And why shouldn't they? Have they ever known anything else? None of it made me happy, but neither was I particularly happy with myself. Now, lest one wonder, I should say up front, I am not an orphan, or not at least in the official sense. At time of writing, both of my parents are still alive, in their mid-80s, but frail, beginning to fail. They don't live together. In fact, despite residing less than a mile apart, they haven't laid eyes on one another for almost 40 years. Not even by accident in the Rite Aid store. Don't ask. They have had 5 rancorous marriages between them. I haven't seen my father more than 10 or 11 times over the past 15 years. That my recurrent sense of psychic estrangement, not to say shock at my students' hooked in, booked up, endlessly bountiful seeming lives, might be in some way connected with these jolly aged peas, as Dickens would have called them, is a topic that would no doubt need a passel of shrinks to explore thoroughly. But even without reference to private psychodrama, I think I can now begin to explain, intellectually at least, why my students' overscheduled lives, so paradoxically combined with intense bonds with their parents, discombobulated me so thoroughly. I've gotten a conceptual grip, found what Freud calls the omphalos, the belly button of the dream, the repressed content. And if I may indulge in a grotesque and no doubt tasteless metaphor, blame it on the aforementioned Sigmund, I shall now attempt to rappel down to it using a not so neatly detached umbilical cord as my belaying rope. Erase. Unsurprisingly, orphanhood, that painful thing, has everything to do with the case. Orphanhood, conceived, that is, in the broadest and most emblematic sense, as a metaphor for modern human experience, as a symbol for unhappy consciousness, as emblem of that groundwork, that inaugural experience of metaphysical solitude that Martin Heidegger deemed necessary for the act of philosophizing. About orphanhood conceived, in other words, as a condition for world-making, as both the sorrow and creative quintessence of life. Now, that is a bit of a mouthful, I realize, so let me explain it in simpler terms. If you teach the history of English and American literature, as I have done for most of my life, it is pretty safe to say you will end up as, among other things, a state-of-the-art orphan expert. Not that it is that hard. You don't need to go back very far in literary history, after all, to find a plethora of orphaned or quasi-orphaned protagonists. At the outset of the play bearing his name, Hamlet, poor little mite, might best be understood, after all, as a sort of half-orphan. Indeed, a half-orphan with a wish to become a full-service orphan. If not downright matricidal, he seems aggrieved enough by his mother's perceived betrayals to wonder if hastening her demise might not make life at Elsinore Castle rather more enjoyable for everybody concerned. And what is Milton's Paradise Lost, if not one of Western culture's great parables of self-orphaning? Along with the Oresteia, the Oedipus plays, it's a sort of poetical primer on how to disorder, really screw up the sacred compact between God and man, to break fundamental taboos, forfeit the love of one's creator in a few outrageous, easy-to-follow steps. Satan is not really to blame for the mess. He's just a figment, the kid who sticks chewing gum on the table leg. Adam and Eve know perfectly well what they are doing when they eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They want to eat it. And when they are seen misery-ridden, leaving life in the garden behind, Milton, they hand in hand with wandering steps and slow through Eden took their solitary way, unquote. They carry with them all the pathos of suddenly abandoned children. They have no mother, at least one presumes, and now their father is dead to them. Worse yet, they're wise orphans. They recognize their own culpability in their loss. Cosmically amplifying their sorrow is a sickening, banal, no-way-back knowledge that they've brought their banishment on themselves. Yes, Daddy took the T-bird away, but we should never have been driving it in the first place. Still, it is in classic English and American fiction, in the novel, say, from Daniel Defoe, Aphra Behn, Fielding, to Dickens, Eliot, Twain, James, Woolf, Forster, Hemingway, and the rest, that the orphaned or semi-orphaned hero or heroine becomes a central, if not inescapable, fixture. Something about the new social and psychic world in which the realistic novel comes into being in Europe in the late 17th and early 18th century pushes the orphan to the foreground of the mix, makes of him or her a strikingly necessary figure, a kind of exemplary being. By orphan, I also include here likewise those characters, call them pseudo-orphans, who believe themselves to be orphans, but over the course of a narrative discover a mother or father or both. So distinctly and memorably have these one-of-a-kind characters been drawn, we often know them by a single name or nickname: Moll, Tom, Fanny, Becky, Heathcliff, Jane, Pip, Oliver, Ishmael, Natty, Huck, Dorothea, Jude, Isabel, Daisy, Millie, Lily, Lolly, Sula. Even if you haven't read the books in which such invented beings appear, you've probably heard of them and their stories. You may even have a rudimentary sense of what they are like as people: self-reliant, footloose, attractive, curious, quick-thinking, lucky, tricky, possibly a mischief maker, the proverbial black sheep, and so on, so on. Intriguingly enough, orphaned protagonists appear with alarming regularity in novels and stories written explicitly for children. Witness the celebrated Little Goody Two-Shoes, Pollyanna, Heidi, Little Orphan Annie, Kim, Mowgli, Bilbo, Frodo, Anne of Green Gables, Dorothy, she of Toto and Auntie Em, Peter as in Pan, Harry as in Potter. And needless to say, these parentless juveniles are usually the heroes or heroines of the books in which they appear. They may be wounded or fey or uncanny. And what do we make of the vacant circles that little Orphan Annie has for eyes? Yet they are also resilient, charismatic, and oddly powerful. And thus the first of the two big lit-crit hypotheses I'm going to advance here. More than love, sex, courtship, and marriage, more than inheritance, ambition, rivalry, or disgrace, more than hatred, betrayal, revenge, or death. Orphanhood, the absence of the parent, the frightening yet galvanizing solitude of the child, may be the defining or deep fixation of the novel as a genre, what one might call its primordial matrix or motive, the conditioning psychic reality out of which the form itself develops. Now, even though I've made a talking point of it, what's important here is not only the mere frequency with which orphaned heroes show up in prose fiction since the 18th century. Yes, from Ian Watt's The Rise of the Novel onward, the phenomenon has been noted and inspired brilliant critical commentary. In one of the most profound books on fiction ever written, Tony Tanner's Adultery in the Novel, the author associates the orphan trope with the early novel's tendency towards a kind of ideological instability, its ambiguous, unsettled, unresolved ongoingness, and resistance to closure. Like the prostitute or adventurer, the orphan embodies the new genre's own picaresque or outlaw dynamism. He writes, the novel in its origin might almost be said to be a transgressive mode, inasmuch as it seems to break or mix or adulterate the existing genre expectations of the time. It is not for nothing that many of the protagonists of the early English novels are socially displaced or unplaced figures, orphans, prostitutes, adventurers, etc. They thus represent or incarnate a potentially disruptive or unstabilized energy that may threaten directly or implicitly the organization of society, whether by the indeterminacy of their origin, the uncertainty of the direction in which they will focus their unbonded energy, or their attitude toward the ties that hold society together and that they may choose to slight or break, unquote. In other words, precisely because the orphan hero or heroine is usually untried, unprotected, disadvantaged, not to mention misinformed or uninformed about his or her parentage, he or she can function as a sort of textual free radical, as plot catalyst and story generator, a mixer-upper of things whose search for a legitimate identity or place in the world of the fiction at once jumpstarts the narrative and tends to shunt it away from didacticism and any predictable or programmatic unfolding of events. A fine and flagrant example of such contravention occurs in Defoe's Moll Flanders, 1719. Here it is precisely the heroine's putative orphanhood. She knows only that her mother, whom she presumes to be dead, was a convicted thief and gave birth to her in Newgate Prison, which catalyzes mid-novel one of the novel's most titillating, if also outlandish, episodes, Moll's scandalous marriage by mistake to her own brother. Only well into their marriage, after she has had several children with him, will Moll realize that her chatty mother-in-law is also her mother, long ago transported to America, but now obviously still alive and flourishing. Defoe purports to moralize in Moll Flanders. In his preface, he describes his narrative as entirely free of lewd ideas and immodest turns, and a work, quote, from every part of which something may be learned and some just and religious inference is drawn by which the reader will have something of instruction, unquote. Yet the very mystery in which Moll's birth is initially shrouded, the convenient lack of any clear-cut parental story, also manages to trigger, through some inscrutable narrative magic, one of the novel's most perverse and sensational incidents, and And what on earth are we meant to learn from it? Don't ever get married in case your spouse is your long-lost brother or sister. But Moll Flanders also illuminates an even more profound aspect of the orphan narratives of the 18th and 19th century, their embedding of a certain hard-boiled psychological realism. Even should you recover your lost or alienated parent, that person is still likely to shock or dismay, to be a source of danger or trouble to you. The orphan mentality can persist, alas, post-reunion. Thus, Moll Flanders finds out that, yes, just as she's been told, her mother is a raddled old Newgate jailbird and thief with the livid mark of the branding iron on her hand. Now, for most of us, such a confirmation, even without the incestuous ramifications, would be disillusioning to say the least. Imagine, after years of loneliness and struggle, of longing for a tender parental embrace, you finally miraculously locate your birth mother. She turns out to be a convicted felon, a whore, a liar, a check-kiter, a crystal meth addict. No help there. She's way worse off than I am. Freud famously described the family romance, his term, as the childhood fantasy that one's parents aren't, in fact, one's real parents, that one was switched in the cradle, left in a basket on the doorstep, found under a cabbage leaf or the like, and that one's real father and mother are persons of great wealth, beauty, and high station, a king and queen, perhaps, who will someday return to reclaim you and love you in the way you deserve. He thought that such fantasies were especially likely to develop in children at the birth of a sibling, when anger at the parents for introducing, as it were, such an odious rival into the family circle is at a height. Real parents are disparaged, imagined parents idealized. The scenario in Moll Flanders reads like a cartoon burlesque of the Freudian romance, almost a spoof of it. It's not simply that the lost and found parent turns out to be disappointingly trashy. She's quite shockingly trashy, sneaky, disingenuous, a grifter, a terrible old crone with false teeth, sleazier than you even thought possible are those synthetic hair extenders. But you're stuck with her, it seems, for life, unless you can find a way to write her back out of the story. If you wanted to be fancy about it, you might dub this familial anti-romance the emotional drama of the post-Enlightenment child. Moll does not cease to be orphaned upon rediscovering her mother. On the contrary, she almost immediately abandons her mother and the embarrassing brother, husband, and children in order to resume her wayward, solitary adventuring. And while she will re-encounter the brother later, indeed inherit the plantation in the new world he and the mother have established, Moll never sees her mother again. Psychologically speaking, Moll is as alone at the end of the fiction as she was when she started. The maternal reappearance alters little or nothing in the heroine's inner world. She's what you might call a self-orphaner, an orphan by default, evasive, secretive, deeply intransigent, one of life's permanent orphans. In the broader affective, even existential sense that I deploy the term here then, orphanhood is not necessarily reducible to orphanhood in the literal sense. Metaphorically, one might venture virtually any main character in the early realist novel might be said to be an orphan, including, paradoxically, any number of those heroes and heroines who have a living parent or two, or end up getting one, as Moll does. A feeling of intractable loneliness, of absolute moral and spiritual estrangement from the group may be all that it takes. You don't need to have lost a mother or father in the conventional sense, in other words, to feel psychically orphaned. Indeed, from a certain angle, and this is my second big lit-crit hypothesis, the orphan trope may simply allegorize a fundamental and more disturbing emotional reality in classic fiction, a generic insistence on the destructive nature of close kinship ties. The more you read, the more you confront the difficult truth. Whatever their status in any given narrative, alive, dead, absent, present, lost, found, the maternal and paternal figures in the early English novel are in toto so deeply and overwhelmingly flawed, so cruel, lost, ignorant, greedy, compromised, helpless, selfish, morally absent, or tragically oblivious to their children's needs, one would seem to be better off without them. You might as well be an orphan. Julia Kristeva remarked somewhere, and my wording here is not exact, but something like, in every bourgeois family group, there is one child who has a soul. And thus we meet them in novel after novel, not only those who go literally motherless and fatherless, but also the children with souls, who for precisely that reason will be persecuted by their foolish parents or parental stand-ins, ostracized, abused, made to submit to some hellish moral and spiritual reaming out. Ruthlessly, imperviously, the realistic novels of the early period compulsively foreground this orphaning of the psyche, shape it into parable, and in so doing, I think, dramatize the painful birth of the modern subject, that radically deracinated being, vital yet alone, who goes undefined by caste, class, or membership in a group. And I have many horribly grim examples of this, including one from Richardson's Clarissa, but in the interests of time, I have to jump over, and also Fielding's Tom Jones, skip over some, so you just have to believe you've had all the examples, and they're horrific. One can find a multitude of such dire mamas and papas in English fiction. They are everywhere in works by Smollett, Frances Burney, Elizabeth Inchbald, as well as an essential feature of the Gothic romances of the 1790s. When it comes to depicting parental filial estrangement, the Brontes, the whole bloody lot of them, don't know when to stop. Likewise, Thackeray and Dickens. And while deceptively easygoing in tone, Jane Austen's novels contain an indictment of parents as fraught, arguably, as anything one finds in the Gothic melodramas of Mrs. Radcliffe. Witness the foolish, manipulative, acquisitive, or otherwise spectacularly unsatisfactory mothers and fathers in Northanger Abbey, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion. Austen typically veils the inadequacy, even the malice of her fictional parent figures by festooning them with comic trappings. We laugh at the absurd Mrs. Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, the whinging Mr. Woodhouse, even the monstrous Sir Walter Elliot, the vain, pomaded, Liberace-like, grotesquely rank, obsessed father of Anne Elliot, heroine of Persuasion. Mothers are almost always long dead in Austen, and as in many other works by women writers from the period, the heroine is obliged to live with a cold, oppressive, or dissociated father. In real life, having any of these narcissistic non-grown-ups for a parent would be a nightmare come true. They induce in us a sense of bewilderment and incommensurability. How can Emma, the heroine, coruscating, brilliant, robust, kind, be the child of the dull, muling, psychotically self-centered Mr. Woodhouse? Austen's heroines, in particular, are often changeling-like, sleek, witty, perceptive misfits who appear oddly unintegrated into whatever usually reduced version of the family unit the novelist has devised for them. What to do with parents who fail us so abysmally? Perhaps the most drastic solution is to imagine a fictional world, finally, from which parents have been simply erased, psychically blanked out, absolutely, and long in advance of any narrative unfurling. The hostility toward parent figures that we find in the history of the novel reaches a certain glassy-eyed apogee in these works, Bleak, Bleak, and Bleaker, in which the protagonist's mother and father are, as it were, simply disappeared, so thoroughly repressed, textually speaking, that most of us don't even stop to wonder about them. Unthinkingly, reflexively, we accept the void where they should be. And this is particularly visible in the novels of Charlotte Bronte. In Jane Eyre, we hear about her parents in the beginning. They have died of typhoid sort of overnight, but that's all we ever hear about them in her great, great final novel, Villette. They are not even mentioned. There is no backstory in that novel. And the more you think about it, the stranger it is. The character is just there, sort of in medias res. You sense it in certain Victorian writers, especially an authorial rage so deep and self-renewing at the bitter chill of existence, at the pathetic insufficiency of the care one has received, at the sheer persistence of one's despair, that visualizing a parent-child relation, good or bad, is simply too painful to tolerate. So, you may be wondering, what does any of this gloomy business have to do with my frantic, ambitious, madly multitasking students, or indeed with any of you? With helicopter moms and dads, with so-called Velcro parents, the ones who keep messaging you 24/7. Surely I don't wish to link all the ultra-depressing things one discovers in art and literature, oh, the horror, etc., with the banal, addictive, and anodyne back and forth of contemporary student life. Hello, you have 193 new messages. Checking for software updates. Your startup disk is almost full. Hey, it's Mom. I was just wondering if you'd had time yet to, or do I? My answer must be both circumspect and extremely speculative. I don't wish, on the one hand, to sound like someone simply nostalgic for pain, a relic, a loneliness junkie, a cheerleader for real-world orphanhood, or when you get right down to it, a proponent of Orestes-style matricide or patricide, not usually anyway. On the other hand, however, I can't help but wonder if we haven't lost the thread a bit when it comes to understanding what a higher education ideally should entail. College officials yammer on these days about the needs for students to develop something they piously and often idiotically call critical thinking, and thereby gain a kind of intellectual autonomy, a foothold on adulthood. But I'm wondering if it might not be time to affirm the idea that critical thinking begins at home, or better, with home, which is to say that each one of us at some point needs to think dispassionately and daringly about the homes from which we emerge and what we really think of them. Do you owe your parents your obedience, your deference, your love, your phone calls? The questions sound harsh because they are, but in our Skype-ridden times may require a certain harshness. This always gets a laugh. The illustration at right is Francisco Goya's sublime, horrific masterpiece, Kronos devouring his son, one of the infamous black paintings the artist, near the end of his life, painted on the walls of his house, the Quinta del Sordo, between 1819 and 1823. It depicts a horrifying event in Greek mythology, the cannibalistic murder by the primeval Titan god Kronos, Saturn in the Roman version, of one of his children. Having received a prophecy that he will be overthrown by one of his own offspring, Kronos eats each of his 5 sons at birth. His wife, Ops, however, saves their 6th son, Zeus, by hiding him away on Crete and feeding Kronos a stone in swaddling clothes in place of the newborn, and some Alka-Seltzer to follow. Kronos is fooled, and later, this same Zeus, father of the new Olympian gods, overthrows his father just as predicted. An image to shock and awe, undoubtedly, but also one of the great paintings made in that period we call the Enlightenment, that revolutionary era, say roughly 1660 to 1820, during which, for better or for worse, Western culture began to shake off some of the more baleful and stultifying aspects of the Judeo-Christian past and reimagine itself as modern. The central insight of the period, it's so familiar to us in one sense that we've lost sight of its momentousness, that individual human beings are endowed with critical faculties and powers of moral discernment, and as a result have a right, if not the obligation, to challenge oppressive, unjust, and degrading patterns of authority. Over the course of the 18th century and into the 19th and 20th, more and more educated men, and later some women, felt empowered enough to criticize previously sacrosanct, received ideas, traditional religious beliefs, established forms of government, accepted modes of social, legal, and economic organization, the conventional dynamics of family life, relations between men and women, adults and children, all those cognitive grids through which we customarily make sense of the world. At its most potent, the critique was severe and world-changing. A host of Enlightenment freethinkers, I'm thinking here of Voltaire, Diderot, Rousseau, Hume, Adam Smith, dared to suggest it in multiple ways, that the venerable, cognitive models human beings had mobilized over the centuries to explain the nature of things were often nothing more than self-reinforcing and sometimes barbaric forms of superstition. Applied as dogma or doctrine, these ultimately man-made belief systems had produced a host of ills: savage religious and political strife, greed and exploitation of the many by the few, the enslavement and genocidal killing of masses of people, the degradation of women, children, animals, and the natural world, century upon century, in fact, of unfathomable global suffering. In his iconic essay of 1784, What is Enlightenment?, Immanuel Kant put it thus: enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore, sapere aude, have courage to use your own understanding. I confess I first read these words over 25 years ago, and they have never ceased to thrill me. I understand the Orphan narratives of English literature in the same way I do Goya's painting, as an image designed to shock us into real critical thinking about those titanic figures we call our parents and the larger social and cultural forms they so often wittingly or unwittingly represent. The intimate authority of parents is, after all, the first authority that most of us experience. The parental command, the first utterance we recognize as that which must be obeyed. Pain and suffering, we quickly learn, will result from our disobedience, and soon most of us become adept at shaping our wishes according to a system of superimposed demands. We learn as young children, for example, to control the way we eat eat, drink, and eliminate waste. We learn to clean our own bodies. We learn under what circumstances it is appropriate to yell or scream or cry, and when we must be silent. Later on, adult society will impose further, even more complex demands. Yet, might it not be the case that true advances in human culture, the real leaps in collective understanding, typically come about as a result of some maverick individual action, some fundamental disobedience on the part of the individual subject? Such maverick actions are often disturbing precisely because they need to be to get our attention. We have to be jolted out of a certain complacency. The greatest artists almost invariably disrupt and disturb in this way. Like many of the novelists I've been describing, Goya gives us a shocking scene of intergenerational violence, but he does so precisely, I wager, to force us to confront some of the deepest and hardest feelings we may have about parental authority and its rightful scope, about family violence, about the power of the old over the young, about the role of paternalism in society and government, about whether indeed those people we designate as fathers or mothers, and all of their avatars later, really know best, about whether it's incumbent upon us to exert ourselves against them. You don't have to be a professor, I think, to see that Goya is horrified by a certain bestial, all-absorptive, soul-destroying kind of parental authority, a radical naysayer. The focus in the Kronos painting is on paternal despotism, but elsewhere in Goya's oeuvre, we find a frightful bevy, too, of murderous mothers, notably in Los Caprichos, a suite of fantasy engravings depicting monstrous witches, crones, goats, and owls, all engaging in child torture of different kinds. The questions Goya raises remain awful and unremitting more than 200 years later. Is the rule of life eat or be eaten, even if what you consume is your own child? One of the most terrible things about Kronos devouring his son is surely the fact that the headless child here has the proportions not of a newborn infant, but of an adult human being. Should we resist our Creator's authority? When and how and why? Or should we let ourselves be murdered in its name? When and how and why? Such questions lie at the heart of great literature, too. What the early English novel dramatizes is nothing less, I think, than a radical transformation in human consciousness. For better or for worse, the passionate, fierce, and liberating notion embedded in fiction is that parents are there to be fooled and defied, especially in matters of love, sex, and erotic object choice, that even the most venerated traditions exist to be broken with, that creative power is rightly vested in the individual and in the young rather than the old, that thought is free or should be. The assertion of individual rights ineluctably begins symbolically and every other way with the primal rebellion of the child. So where are we today? I'm almost to the end here. Are we in the midst of some counter-transformation, a rolling back of the Enlightenment parent-child story? Are we returning to the older mode of belief, to a more explicitly authoritarian and elder-centric world? The elder-centric model has dominated most of human history, after all. Maybe the Enlightenment break with the age-old commandment, honor thy father and thy mother, was temporary, an aberration, just a blip on the screen. My own view remains predictably twisty, fraught, and disloyal. Parents, in my view, have to be finessed, thought around, even as we love them. They are so colossally wrong about so many important things. And even when they are not, even when they are 100% right, the imperative remains the same. To live an adult life, indeed to live a creative and meaningful life, it is necessary, I would argue, to engage in, at the very least, a kind of symbolic self-orphaning. The process will be different for every person. I have my own inspirational cast of characters in this regard, a set of willful, heroic self-orphaners, past and present, whom I have always admired and continue to revere. Mozart, the musical child prodigy, who successfully rebelled against an insanely grasping and narcissistic father who had shopped him around for years, around the courts of Europe as a sort of family cash cow. Sigmund Freud, who by way of unflinching self-analysis discovered that it was possible to love and to hate something at precisely the same time, and that such ambivalence was indeed inescapably human. Virginia Woolf, who in spite of childhood loss, mental illness, and an acute sense of the sex prejudice she saw everywhere around her, not only forged a life as one of our great modernist writers, but also made her life an incorrigibly honest and vulnerable one. In a journal entry from 1928 collected in a writer's diary, Woolf wrote the following about her brilliant, troubled, tyrannical, enormously distinguished father, Sir Leslie Stephen, one of the great English men of letters of the 19th century. And he is the model, for those of you who know Woolf, for the mawkish, manipulative, endlessly demanding Mr. Ramsay into the lighthouse. She's writing this 20 years after he has died. Father's birthday. He would have been 96, yes, today, and could have been 96, like other people one had known, but mercifully was not. His life would have entirely ended mine. What would have happened? No writing, no books, inconceivable. Unquote. The current sentimental pathology of the American middle-class family, not to mention the mind-warping digitalization of everyday life, militates against such ruthlessness and candor. But what the life of the orphan teaches, or has taught me at least, is that it is indeed the self-conscious abrogation of one's inheritance, the making strange of received ideas, the cultivation of a willingness to defy, debunk, or just plain old disappoint one's parents, that is the absolute precondition now more than ever for any sort of intellectual, emotional, and moral freedom. Thank you.